Manfred's request here. And as you heard, we want to record this part of the session because we think that we will have important messages that we need to share also with the wider audience. So I hope it's okay for everybody that we start the recording. This has been agreed with our expert, Jacob Mchangama, who you can see some parts of his CV, summary of his CV. He's founder and executive director of Justitia, a Danish think tank working on human rights, freedom of speech, and rule of law, all dear issues to liberals. As also visiting fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, Washington. He is a high-profile discussant in Denmark and worldwide, and his writings, the one book 2016, History of Freedom of Speech, highly cited, and he is now also going to introduce and publish a new book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. Welcome, Jacob, and we are sure that you will give us a lot of food for thought, examples of how freedom of speech is emerging, how is it managing in the new paradigm shift that we are seeing at the moment. So Jacob, the line is yours, so to say.
Thank you very much. I'm honored and delighted to get this invitation. I almost didn't make it. As you can see from my face, I look not as fresh as I should have. No torture has been applied to me. Denmark has not become an authoritarian state overnight, but yeah. But first of all, I want to congratulate you all for your principles about human rights and digitization. Those are all extremely important issues to grapple with, but they're also very difficult issues. So if you'll allow me, I'll try to focus on what I know most about, which is free speech, also in the digital era, because I think that we live currently in quite a paradoxical time. On the one hand, there's never been a time in the history of humankind where people around the world have been able to share and access information at the scale, speed, and global reach available to us now. And almost 60% of the global population, almost 5 billion people, are online, and more than 4 billion people are active social media users. And so this obviously gives people an opportunity that past generations could only dream of in terms of communicating. However, at the same time, we also experience that free speech has actually been in decline for more than a decade, and that is also true online, because I think it's a bit of an iron law of history that whenever you experience a revolutions in communications technology that basically pulls the rug from established authority and gatekeepers, that will lead to a lot of uncertainty, and that the knee-jerk reaction will be to turn to good old forms of censorship. But those forms of censorship are have changed somewhat in the world that we live in. Now, initially, the internet, it was thought that the internet would more or less make traditional censorship obsolete, because how could states control what was being communicated and sent on private networks? However, I think that anyone looking at where we are now will see that states have found very clever ways to impose control, not least through the big platforms that have emerged, because what we've seen is also what I call a platformization of the internet. In other words, we have big actors like Facebook, like YouTube, like TikTok, that where a lot of traffic runs through, and where it becomes extremely important for many people to be present if they want to share their message to significant amounts of people. And these private actors can then act as choke points for the spread of information. And what is particularly ironic, is perhaps a way to say it, is that the liberal democracies of Europe have been at the forefront of forging the chains with which social media have been bound, or are increasingly bound in today's world. So many of you are probably familiar with the NetzDG, the Network Enforcement Act, that Germany adopted in 2017, and which obliges platforms with 2 million users to remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours or risk rather hefty fines. Now, the NetzDG has been copy pasted by a number of countries around the world since then. We've done 2 reports sort of following the spread of the NetzDG, and among those countries that explicitly reference the German model, we find Russia, we find Venezuela, we find Turkey, we find Singapore, I think Nigeria, Pakistan. You do also find your Austria. You find Denmark. Denmark is on the way now of copy pasting it. But the majority of the countries that had more than 20 countries that had gone down the road of the NetzDG were countries that were authoritarian or illiberal. And the fact that they were able to point to Germany as the sort of trendsetter means that it becomes more difficult for open democracies to criticize them, because even though Germany, obviously, Germany's effort, I would say, was a good faith effort gone wrong. I think it was predictably gone wrong, depending on your conception of free speech. But these other copycats do not include the same rule of law guarantees. They typically involve many more types of content, and are targeted at basically targeted at dissent, which makes it much more difficult. And so you can see, for instance, in a number of cases in Russia where TikTok, YouTube, now Apple have removed content or apps used by the opposition, used by Navalny to communicate. And why have they done that? Because it's illegal under Russian law. It's considered extremism, and so they're forced to do it. So that's basically the same principle as under the NetzDG. So, but of course, this you could say makes it more difficult for the liberal part of the world to fight this phenomena if we are not, the liberal democracies of the world are not willing to stand firm on the principle of free speech. And I think authoritarian states have been very clever in taking advantage of that. Another reason why it's extremely difficult is that attitudes towards free speech vary very widely across the globe. So earlier this year, we released a survey of global attitudes towards free speech in 33 countries around the world. And if you ask people around the world, is free speech important? Something like 94% say yes. Yes, free speech is really important. But then when you get into the nitty-gritty, you see huge differences in attitudes. So if you ask people in the Scandinavian countries and Northern European countries, whether free speech should include the right to offend religion or even minorities. Majorities will say, yes, free speech is that important that we must allow it even for things that can be offensive. But if you go to Kenya, Pakistan, and Turkey, you will find much, much lower degree of tolerance. And that, of course, when you have the internet, when you have global platforms that have to cater to the whole world, then it becomes very, very difficult to find a sweet spot when people fundamentally disagree about where the limits on free speech should be drawn. So what should be, how should we go about, how can we find a solution that will make everyone happy? First of all, I think we should start from the premise that free speech is not meant to make everyone happy. It's not, free speech is not about a principle about, sitting around necessarily and being happy and in agreement. Free speech is about disagreement. Disagreement fuels emotions, sentiment. So it's okay to be offended. It's okay to be mad by what other people say. That's a basic premise. You cannot have free speech without being offended, at least not in the political arena. But I think our thinking is that platforms like Facebook, like YouTube, like Twitter, should adopt a human rights approach based on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights under the UN. Article 19 there's been a lot of work with the Rabat Plan of Action, for instance, at the UN, at trying to sort of distill what are the obligations. And I would argue that at the UN level has a stronger protection of free speech than what follows, for instance, under the European Convention on Human Rights and the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, which is how can I be diplomatic, not necessarily the strongest defender of controversial speech. But at the same time, we urge these platforms to ensure that end users can have much more control over their content. I think that is basically the only way we can come to some sort of way of living with each other. In other words, if you are extremely offended about one type of speech, then you can filter the content that you get. But that allows others who are not necessarily offended by the content that offends you to still have discussions that you don't want to be part of. It could even be a situation where you could allow anti-discrimination NGOs to develop filters that could be used on social media platforms that have more expansive definitions of racism, for instance, than those that are comprised by international human rights law. I think that is our thinking on the least bad way to regulate the online sphere and ensure freedom of expression. Because the way that we're heading right now is that basically I think we're seeing that more and more groups are fighting to have their specific red lines acknowledged by states and platforms, and they see it as a win for them to have certain contents that they feel strongly about banned. And this is a slippery slope because basically it means that we're approaching the lowest common denominator rather than adopting a human rights approach where we say, well, only very, very, very limited amounts of content should be deleted from the online sphere. I also think, in finishing, that the European approach to this is somewhat unsolidaric towards those who live, who are dissidents, who may live in countries where social media and the internet might be the only way to really bypass official censorship and official propaganda. So that's why I think stable, open traditional democracies must learn to live with the fact that when you allow egalitarian speech, in which in principle everyone has a voice, you will have to tolerate that some of the things that are being said are not very nice, and you'll have to hold your nose. But if you want to weed out all of the things that smell, you're basically going to end up chopping away the very principle of free speech. So that would be my opening comments, and I'm very open to any comments, questions, criticisms. Thank you.
As I kind of promised, I thought that Jacob would give us really food for thought, and I was waiting for your comments on the jurisprudence of the European Court on human rights, because they have kind of drawn the lines that are now very guiding principles for many European countries. But still, of course, you have a situation where, let's say, this is the kind of panic reaction in some countries where Trump was denied access to Twitter, and some of the platforms act in that way. So the obvious question, and I hope you can take some questions because we are as running out of time, but I can just promise that we need to continue with Jacob this discussion with some other with the fellow members of the committee. But let's say this is the reaction, because we are fearing that what would happen with democracy. We saw what happened with democracy when radio was introduced, and that led to authoritarianism. And we debated that hopefully we don't go down that way. But if I may, I will take two short questions from our friends Olga in Russia and Phil Bennion, vice chair of the committee, and then I pass the floor to you, Jacob.
Astrid, if you allow me, you have only 3 minutes left.
Yes, okay, we have 3 minutes left. So Olga 1 minute, Phil 1 minute, and then we'll also give the floor to Manfred. Olga, 1 minute.
Thank you, Jacob. It was very interesting. So to be very short, speaking about Russia, first, Navalny is not the democratic opposition. And now I will not be speaking about the Navalny case. I'm speaking about the case with democratic opposition. Before the elections, we were not allowed to campaign in the Facebook. Any dissenting opinion was banned. People were banned immediately by the Facebook. I read that they have some company doing this for that, but it's definitely affiliated with the state, because absolutely everything was marked out. So are there any solutions? Can we, as a community, as a large international community, approach to the Facebook? I think it's not only our problem in Russia. Maybe some other countries have experienced that. But in Russia, it was something terrible, unprecedented.
Yes, and Phil, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, a completely different angle. My former MEP colleagues from the UK had arranged a debate in the Liberal Club a couple of months back, and one of the speakers there, one of the participants was Evan Harris, who used to be a Liberal Democrat MP, and we were talking about freedom of speech, and he raised the issue of censorship, not by authorities, not by authoritarian states, but by the mob. Particularly through trolling and basically silencing people through intimidation, even if that's only online intimidation. I just wondered what Jacob's views are on the threat of censorship by the mob.
Okay, Jacob, the floor is yours, and as I said, we continue the discussion, but the first answers to these interventions, Olga and Phil.
Yeah, no, I think, the situation that you mentioned in Russia with opposition voices having their content removed from Facebook shows the problem. And I think you've seen a shift in the global platforms. You may remember in the beginning, they were sort of very, hey, free speech. But then when they saw that there was pushback from governments, they became much more willing tools to remove content. And at the end of the day, Mark Zuckerberg's responsibility is to his shareholders and his other stakeholders. It's not to the democratic opposition in Russia. And that's why democratic states in Europe should push and criticize them. And that's why we should say this is not good enough. Google has so far resisted going into China, but you may have seen a story like a year ago where they were preparing to go into China, basically with a search engine that would internalize the red lines of the Communist Party. And I think that's just the nature of these big companies. They are not. They might have been born with sort of civil libertarian impulses, but when those hit the shareholder concerns, they are probably going to take a back seat. And that's also why adopting an international human rights approach would give them some basis to resist Russia. Obviously, at the end of the day, you have to follow Russian law in Russia, but that would at least give them to say, listen, we don't agree with this. Our human rights say we can't do that, and then that would bring publicity to it rather than they sort of silently moving the voices of those who criticize.
I'll do it with you because we are almost silent
please.
in Russia.
Yeah.
And in terms of thought, I don't have a good answer on how to what to do with the mob. I guess the mob has always been there, but I think one thing is that we'll have to sort of pluck up our courage and keep to our opinions, even if people try to launch a troll army at us, and also remember that sometimes when you look at what's going on at Twitter, you tend to think, oh, everyone in the world thinks that, but typically that's not the case. Twitter is not necessarily public opinion, so there are other people out there. But obviously, when it crosses into the territory of threats and outright intimidation, that's where the platform should put down the foot.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jacob. And sorry, Olga, I'm not given more time now for this discussion. But
thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And we will continue the discussion. I think there are lots of things still to debate, so there will be new possibilities, and I encourage you to have a look at the recording. So thank you, and now I hand over to Hakima, our president, please.
Thank you, Astrid. It was a really very interesting discussion, and I'm sorry to interrupt it, but we should move with the agenda. So thank you so much, dear friends. Today you heard from our Human Rights Committee Chair, Astrid Thors, and you heard also from Irene the presentation. I would like to seize this opportunity to thank both of you, Astrid and Irene, for the very interesting presentation. I would like to thank also the members of the Human Rights Committee. Thanks to your hard work, Eli has now the WIP Index, Women Empowerment Program, the Liberal Principles of Digitalization, the Radical Venture Policy Labs, and released 29 statements, and it's submitting now communications procedure on generation equality commitment maker to the UN. So huge job. Thank you so much, Astrid and Irene and all the committee members. Now we will listen to our Deputy President, Dr. Karl Paquet, to share of our working group on trade. Then we will listen to Minister Steven Lennart, the chair of the Climate Justice Committee. But before giving the floor to our committee chairs, please note that there will be an opportunity to vote on new policy documents in the field of trade and climate. I will maybe ask Jason to fix the voting process together with you so that you can vote on time. So I will now hand the floor to Carl to report on the World Trade Committee. Carl, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hakima, dear liberal friends.